A Loving Family, written by Dilly, read by Penelope Freeman. The moral right of the author has been asserted. Chapter 1. Barrack Hospital, Scutari, 1855. The smell of lye soap could not mask the stench of disease and death that filtered from the hospital wards to the laundry room in the basement of the barrack hospital. The army wives and camp followers attempted to cope with the soiled bedding and blood-stained bandages of the wounded soldiers, but it was a never-ending battle. Miss Nightingale rarely showed her face in the hellhole below the ground, where the washerwomen were often as sick as the men, lying in the hospital beds. Sancha Romero had been working since daybreak, and now it was late in the evening. She knew that she was ill. She'd seen many of her comrades sicken and collapse in the rat-infested cellars, which were never intended to be used for such work. With little ventilation and the overpowering heat from the coppers, they were a breeding ground for the cholera and dysentery that Miss Nightingale and her nurses were trying so desperately to eradicate. "I must go back to our tent," Sancha whispered to the woman who was scrubbing a blood-stained sheet on a washboard. "My daughter is all alone. She needs me more than the poor devils on the wards." Nellie Jones made the sign of the cross on her flat chest. "I wish I'd never followed my old man to the battlefield. I should have stayed at home in Spitalfields, even if I had to put up with a mean old bitch of a mother-in-law. And I wish to God that I had." Sancha clasped a work-roughened hand to her forehead. She was burning up with fever. She knew the danger signs only too well. "I have to go, Nellie." Gathering strength from the thought of seeing her 14-year-old daughter, perhaps for the last time, Sancha made her way between the steaming coppers towards the stone steps. Outside the building, the hospital yard was filled with the injured on stretchers, or simply lying on the ground where they'd been left to await admission. Their pathetic groans and pleas for water made her cover her ears, and the rumble of the cart taking the deceased to the mortuary would echo in her head long after she had reached the haven of their makeshift accommodation. It seemed that there was no escape from this terrible place, but Sancha was determined that her beautiful child would not suffer a similar fate to the one she knew awaited her. She feared that time was not on her side. She found Jacinta huddled in the rough shelter of canvas that had been their home since they arrived at Scutari weeks ago. How long exactly they'd been in this hell on earth she didn't know, but it felt as though it had been forever. She had watched her man die slowly and painfully from the wounds he had received in battle, and she'd been helpless to save him. Fred Wilton's last wish had been for her to take their daughter to London, where they had met when Sancha was a girl of 13, but it was not easy to get a passage home. Orphaned by the death of her immigrant parents in a typhoid epidemic, she had been roaming the streets begging for food when Fred had come across her. It had been love at first sight, although they had never got round to making their union legal. She had known it was not a good idea to bring their daughter with them, but Fred had insisted on keeping their small family together. Jacinta had always been her father's pet, and Fred had insisted that his little girl would be kept safe. With his last breath, the husband of her heart and father of her beloved daughter had declared his love for them. Sancha wiped a tear from her eye as she lifted the canvas tent flap and saw her daughter huddled up against the bitter cold. "Jacinta," she whispered, "I am sick. You must leave here immediately." Jacinta raised a tear-stained face and her lips trembled. "No, Mama, I won't leave you." Sancha shook her head. "You are to leave tonight on the steamboat heading for Boulogne. It is all arranged. You are to travel with one of the nurses in charge of the soldiers who are being repatriated. You are going to England. Your father's family will look after you. I have written them a letter." Breathless and burning up with fever, Sancha pulled a crumpled piece of paper from her pocket and pressed it into her daughter's hand. "I cannot look after you, my darling child. I will soon be joining your father in heaven. I have followed him since I was a girl like you, and in death we will be reunited."
Sample complete. Ready to continue?